I warned you.
Celeste Vicenzi had a suicidal plan. Walk into the dawn of the Balocchi Familia's bedroom, in a baby doll, at midnight, to confront him about her father's murder. And when Renzo Balocchi opened his eyes and saw her there, white silk against golden skin, he said, "If you walk into my room like this again, you're not leaving alive." Then she smiled, her first real smile in 5 years. "I'll come in, but next time I'm coming armed." Hi, I'm Lena, the owner of this channel. So today, my special shout out goes to Kavanaugh and Rosa. Thanks for your support, guys. Now tell me something. Can love between people from rival families work? Let me know in the comments. Chapter 1: Baby Doll and Confrontation.
I saw him near the villa. He shouldn't be here.
Renzo Balocchi's bedroom door wasn't locked, and that should have been my first warning that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But I didn't come all the way to Villa Balocchi, in the middle of the Sicilian night, to back down in front of an open door. I came to look into the eyes of the man who destroyed my family, and pull from him the confession I'd been chasing for 5 years. The white silk baby doll I wore wasn't my choice. It was strategy. Women who entered an Italian Mafia don's bedroom usually had a very specific intention, and I needed the guards to think exactly that when they saw me walking through the corridors. I needed them to see me as just another temporary conquest of their boss, not as Marco Vicenzi's daughter coming to collect a blood debt. My bare feet made no sound against the cold marble as I moved through the room plunged in shadows. Moonlight streamed through the wide windows, illuminating Renzo Balocchi's silhouette. Asleep in the king-size bed, and even sleeping, he looked dangerous in a way that made my heart race with fear and anger in equal parts. I stood there, watching the man who commanded one of the most powerful families in Sicily, and touched the knife hidden on my thigh. The Krav Maga classes my father insisted I take since I was 8 taught me how to kill, but being here now, feet away from his murderer, was different from any training I'd ever done. He woke up before I decided to move closer. The instinct of a born predator made his eyes open and find me immediately, without the slightest trace of sleep or disorientation, and I realized he already knew I was there long before opening his eyes. Renzo sat up in bed, with a calm that was more frightening than any display of anger could be. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and the moonlight drew shadows on his abs, but I forced my attention to remain on his face, on the dark eyes studying me with an intensity that made my skin tingle. "If you walk into my room like this again," he said, his voice rough with sleep but loaded with deadly threat, "you're not leaving alive." The threat should have made me back down, should have reminded me of the danger I was running, but instead, something inside me broke free, something that had been trapped for 5 years. Since the day I buried my father and swore I'd find the man responsible, and I felt my lips curve, the first real smile in 5 years. "I'll come in," I said, feeling the adrenaline rush through my veins. "But next time I'm coming armed." The silence that followed was thick, loaded with tension that made the air feel heavier. Renzo watched me for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant his expression changed from controlled surprise to something that looked dangerously close to interest. "Celeste Vicenzi," he said, and my name in his voice sounded like accusation and recognition at the same time. "Marco Vicenzi's daughter." It wasn't a question. "You remember his name?" I said. Renzo tilted his head, studying me with attention that seemed to see through the white silk, through the skin, straight to the bones. "I remember them all," he answered, pausing. "The question is, what do you want?" I took a step forward, out of the shadows. "Confirmation." "Of what?" "That it was you, that you ordered my father killed." The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, Mount Etna smoked against the starry sky, a threatening presence that matched perfectly with the man in front of me, and all of Sicily seemed to be holding its breath. Renzo got out of bed with fluid movements, like a predator preparing to attack. He moved to the window, turning his back to me in a way that was clearly a test, and I realized he wanted to see if I'd take the opportunity to attack him. "And if I had killed your father," he said, looking at the nighttime landscape, "you'd already be dead. So it was you," I said, anger burning in my chest. He turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw something like genuine interest on his face. "I neither confirm nor deny," he said, starting to approach with measured steps. "But Celeste," my name sounded different now, softer, more dangerous. "If you suspect, why did you come here? Alone? Vulnerable? Who said I'm vulnerable?" He stopped too close. So close I could feel the heat emanating from his body. So close I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. "You're not who you appear to be," Renzo said, and those dark eyes searched my face as if reading secrets. "None of us are," I replied. "The difference is that I admit it." Something changed in the air between us. The temperature seemed to rise, and suddenly I was aware of every inch of space separating us, of the way his breathing deepened, of how my own lungs things seemed to have forgotten how to function. Renzo invaded my personal space completely, and I smelled him. Something woody and expensive mixed with whiskey and danger. "You know I can kill you. Here, now." It should have been a threat, but it came out almost like a whisper, and I realized there was something else happening here. There was an invisible electric current between us. There was tension that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with the way he was looking at my mouth. "You can," I said, my voice coming out hoarse, "but you won't." "Why not?" "Because I'm the only person who looks at you like you could bleed." I paused. "And you like it." The silence was loaded with something intense. Renzo went completely still, his eyes fixed on mine, and I could see the pulse beating in his neck, the way his jaw muscles contracted. Then he took a step back. Just one, but it was as if a spell had been broken. "Get out of my room. I'm not finished yet." "Yes, we are." Before I could react, his hand was on my arm. It didn't hurt, but it was firm, too hot against my skin. "You're staying at the villa tonight. Storm outside. In the morning. You decide. If you want to continue this game, or if you want to live." I looked at his hand on my arm, then back at his face. "And if I choose the game?" Something dangerous flickered in his eyes, and a smile formed on his lips, small and deadly. "Then you'll find out why I'm Dawn." He released me abruptly. "Guest room. Second door on the right." A pause. "And Celeste? Next time. Knock first." He moved away, but his eyes never left mine. There was something in that look that was more intimate than the touch had been, something that made my stomach clench in a disturbing way. I should leave, but my feet seemed glued to the floor. Finally, I forced myself to move, crossing the room toward the door, feeling his gaze burning on my back. But when my hand touched the doorknob, I couldn't resist the impulse to look back. Renzo was still where I'd left him, illuminated by the moon, half in shadows, completely motionless. We watched each other across the distance, and he looked like a statue carved in marble and danger. "Good night, Don Bellocchi," I said. "Good night, Celeste Vicenzi," he replied, and the way he said my full name sounded like promise and threat. I left the room before I could do something insane. My feet carried me to the second door on the right, and I locked myself in the guest room with trembling hands, feeling like I'd just escaped something dangerous, and at the same time, thrown myself into another trap. Only when I was alone, with the door closed, did I allow my knees to weaken. I slid down the back of the door until I was sitting on the cold floor, my heart beating too hard, and the adrenaline that had sustained me began to dissipate, leaving only trembling in my hands. Unconsciously, I brought my hand to the arm where Renzo had held me. The skin was still warm, still tingling with the memory of his touch. "Shit," I whispered to the empty room. "I came here with a clear objective, confront my father's murderer and get a confession." But he didn't confess, didn't deny, just looked at me with those eyes that seemed to see everything. And now I was locked in a guest room at his villa, with the ghost of his touch still burning on my skin. Outside, I heard the wind beginning to howl, bringing the storm Renzo had mentioned. Lightning illuminated the room for brief moments, followed by thunder that made the windows vibrate, and Sicily was unleashing its fury as if responding to the tension still pulsing in the air. I forced myself off the floor and explored the room. It was luxurious in a discreet way, with antique furniture that probably cost more than everything I owned, and the bed was covered with sheets that felt like clouds. But I couldn't stop thinking about the room across the hall, about the man who slept there, or maybe wasn't sleeping anymore, and I wondered if he was as affected as I was by our encounter. I grabbed my phone from the small purse I'd hidden here earlier. Several messages from friends who didn't know where I really was, and if they knew I'd entered the Don of the Bellocchi family's villa to confront him about a murder, they would have had me committed. I deleted the messages and tossed the phone on the bed. I leaned against the window and watched the storm approaching, the lightning illuminating Mount Etna in the distance. My father used to say that Sicily was an island of passion and violence, where love and death danced together. I always thought he was being too poetic, but now, standing in this room, still feeling the heat of Renzo's touch on my skin, I was beginning to understand. "Tomorrow," Renzo said, "I'd have to decide, continue the game or choose to live." But as I looked at the storm, at the smoking volcano, I realized one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't backing down, not after coming this far, not after finally being this close to the man who ordered my father's death. Renzo Bellocchi might be dangerous, might be deadly, but I'd trained my whole life for this moment, and if he thought he could intimidate me with intense looks and touches that made my skin burn, he was about to discover that Marco Vicenzi's daughter didn't back down from anything, especially not from the man who made me an orphan. Chapter 2. Game Begins and Dangerous Chemistry.
I want the truth.
What are you talking about?
I woke up to the Sicilian sun streaming through the guest room windows, and for a brief moment, I forgot where I was. Then the memory of the previous night came back like a wave, bringing with it the recollection of dark eyes studying me, of a firm hand on my arm, of a husky voice saying my full name like it was a sentence. I got out of bed and found clean clothes left on a chair near the door, a simple dress in light cotton that definitely wasn't mine, Someone had entered the room while I slept, and the fact that I didn't wake up only proved how exhausted I was after the confrontation with Renzo. I took a quick shower and put on what I'd been offered, pulling my wet hair into a simple bun. I had no makeup, nothing but the clothes on my body, and somehow this made me feel more vulnerable than last night's baby doll. I left the room without knowing exactly where to go, but I followed the smell of coffee coming from somewhere in the villa. The hallways were wide and decorated with old Italian art, and each step I took against the marble echoed in a way that made me feel small in this palace of power and danger. I found the terrace without much difficulty. The view was breathtaking. Mount Etna dominating the horizon, smoking gently as if it were asleep but not dead, just waiting for the right moment to wake up. And there was something disturbing about the way it perfectly mirrored the man sitting at the table. Renzo was there, wearing dark pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, reading an Italian newspaper while drinking espresso. He didn't look up when I approached, but I knew he'd heard me coming, knew he was perfectly aware of my presence even while pretending otherwise. I sat in the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. If he wanted to ignore me, he'd have to work harder at it. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Good morning." He turned the page of the newspaper, still not looking at me. "About yesterday." "Yesterday didn't happen." I blinked, confused. "It didn't?" Finally, he looked up, and the impact of that gaze was as intense as it had been the night before. "You had a nightmare. Sleepwalking. It happens." It took me a second to process what he was doing. He was giving me an out, a way to pretend I'd never walked into his room dressed in white silk, that I'd never confronted him about my father's murder, and I wondered if it was out of kindness or strategy. I laughed, unable to contain the reaction. Sleepwalking. How convenient. Something like amusement crossed his face, but before either of us could say anything else, I heard footsteps approaching. Don Bellocchi, Signorina Vicenzi. The man who appeared on the terrace was older, probably in his 60s, dressed impeccably in an Italian suit that probably cost more than a car. He had perfectly combed gray hair and eyes that seemed kind, but there was something about him that immediately made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. He took my hand before I could avoid it and kissed it in a chivalrous manner. What a pleasure. Unexpected. I withdrew my hand as politely as possible. "Signore Torretti, Lazzaro Torretti, consigliere of the Famiglia." He studied me with an interest that was too intense, too invasive. "Marco's daughter, right? I knew your father. Very interesting man." The way he said interesting made my stomach clench. There was something behind that word, something I couldn't decipher, but that definitely wasn't a compliment. "Lazzaro." Renzo's voice cut through the air with cold authority. "Report can wait." It was an order disguised as a suggestion, and Lazzaro clearly understood. "Of course." He turned to me again, that smile still on his face. "Perhaps we can talk later, about memories." Then he left, leaving an uncomfortable silence on the terrace. I looked at Renzo, who was watching where Lazzaro had disappeared with an expression I couldn't read. "He knew my father?" I asked, still feeling the discomfort from the interaction. "Everyone knew your father." Renzo returned his attention to me, and there was something different in his gaze now, something more calculating. "The question is, did you know your father?" "What do you mean?" "Marco Vicenzi, accountant, family man." He paused deliberately. "And thief." Anger exploded in my chest like liquid fire. "My father was not. Stole 2 million. From the Famiglia." Renzo pulled some papers from inside the newspaper he'd been reading, placing them on the table between us. Bank statements, documents with numbers and dates, account in the Caymans, his name. I grabbed the papers with trembling hands, my eyes scanning the information, and I felt my world begin to crumble. There it was, printed in black and white. Marco Vicenzi, a bank account I never knew existed. Transfers of amounts that made no sense for the modest life my father had always lived. He wouldn't. My voice failed, and I hated how weak it sounded. "He did, and you know it." Renzo leaned forward, his eyes fixed on mine. "The question is, did you come for justice or revenge?" Tears burned in my eyes, but they were tears of anger, not sadness. "I came for the truth. Truth hurts, cara mia. You sure you want it?" I wiped the tears with the back of my hand, refusing to look weak in front of him. "Yes." Something changed in Renzo's face. It wasn't exactly a smile, but there was something that looked suspiciously close to respect. "Okay, you stay. 1 week. See how it works. Decide after. And if I decide you killed my father." Now he smiled, and it was dangerous and beautiful at the same time. "Then you try to kill me." A pause, and we find out who's better. An involuntary shiver ran down my spine, and it wasn't just from fear. There was something disturbingly exciting about the way he challenged me, the way he didn't treat me like an insignificant threat, but like someone who could actually be dangerous. "Deal," I said. "Ben." Renzo stood up from the chair with that fluid grace that seemed natural to him. "Agostino will show you the property. And Celeste." He stopped, looking at me with an intensity that made my heart race. "Here we have rules. Family above all. Loyalty to the death. And lies. His eyes pierced mine. Lies kill. Then he left the terrace, leaving me alone with the documents scattered on the table and a whirlwind of emotions I didn't know how to process. What the fuck did I do? I whispered to the empty air, because now it wasn't just about confronting my father's killer. Now it was about discovering who my father really was, if those documents were real or forged, if everything I believed about Marco Vincenzi was a lie or the truth. And somehow, Renzo Bellocchi was at the center of it all, looking at me with those eyes that seemed to see through every defense I had. I picked up the documents again, studying them more carefully. The handwriting, the signatures, the numbers that made no sense for the modest life my father had always lived. $2 million. It was a fortune, and if he'd really stolen it from the Bellocchi familia, then maybe Renzo had every right to have him killed. The thought made me sick. I'd spent 5 years believing my father was an innocent victim, that Renzo Bellocchi was a monster who needed to pay. But what if I was wrong? What if my father was the criminal, and his death was just Mafia justice? No, I refused to believe that without more evidence. Documents could be forged. Bank accounts could be created, and someone clearly wanted me to believe my father was a thief. The question was, who benefited from this narrative? Signorina Vincenzi? I looked up and saw a middle-aged man approaching the terrace. He had features that vaguely reminded me of Renzo, the same strong bone structure, the same dark eyes, and I guessed he was family. Agostino Bellocchi, he introduced himself with a slight nod. Renzo's cousin. He asked me to show you the property. Of course, I said, gathering the documents and standing up. Agostino observed me with curiosity as we walked through the villa. Unlike Lazzaro, there was nothing uncomfortable about him, just genuine interest mixed with understandable caution. You're the first person Renzo has allowed to stay here, he said eventually, who isn't part of the familia. He's not allowing me, I corrected. He's testing me. Agostino smiled. Maybe it's the same thing. To him. We passed through perfectly manicured gardens, ancient fountains, areas of the villa that seemed to have centuries of history impregnated in the walls. Agostino explained the family structure, how the business worked, always with that caution of someone who knew exactly how much information to give and how much to withhold. Can I ask a question? I said eventually. Depends on the question. Lazzaro Toretti. How long has he been consigliere? Agostino stopped walking, studying me more carefully. Since before Renzo became Don. Why do you ask? Just curious, I lied. But from the way he looked at me, it was clear he didn't believe it. Lazzaro was the one who raised Renzo after his father died, Agostino said carefully. He's important to the familia, but not to you, I thought, catching something in his tone. There was reservation there, maybe even distrust, and I wondered if Agostino also felt that discomfort that Lazzaro inspired. We returned inside the villa when the sun was already high in the sky. Agostino left me in the library, an impressive room with shelves that went from floor to ceiling, and books that were probably worth fortunes. Renzo will be busy until dinner, he said. You're free to explore. But Signorina Vincenzi, he looked at me seriously. Be careful. Not everyone here is your friend. Then he left, leaving me alone in a sea of books and secrets. I spent the rest of the day exploring the library, looking for anything that could give me more information about the Bellocchi familia, about my father, about what really happened 5 years ago. But all I found were books about Italian history, philosophy, and some novels in English that seemed out of place. When the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, I caught myself thinking about Renzo, about where he was, what he was doing, if he was thinking about me as much as I was thinking about him, and I hated the fact that thought even crossed my mind. He was my enemy, the man who probably ordered my father's death. It didn't matter how my heart raced when he looked at me. It didn't matter how my skin tingled when he touched me. None of it mattered. I was here for justice, for truth, for revenge, if necessary, and nothing, not even dark eyes and dangerous smiles, was going to divert me from that path. Chapter 3. Provocations and Discoveries.
Stop looking at me.
The following days at Villa Bellocchi passed in a fog of observation and discovery. Renzo gave me access to almost the entire property, except for his office, and some areas that Agostino politely suggested I avoid, and I took advantage of every second to study the man I'd come here to confront. What I discovered surprised me in ways I didn't expect. Renzo Bellocchi wasn't the sadistic monster I'd built up in my head over 5 years. He was calculating, yes. Dangerous for sure, but he was also fair in a way that defied everything I thought I knew about the Mafia. I saw how the men of the Famiglia respected him, not just out of fear, but out of genuine loyalty. I saw how he resolved disputes with cold logic, but also with unexpected compassion. I saw how he commanded with absolute authority, but also listened to advice before making decisions. And I saw, more than I'd like to admit, how he watched me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. There was something disturbing about the way his eyes followed me through the hallways, how he always seemed to know where I was, even when we weren't in the same room, how an invisible tension formed in the air whenever we encountered each other. It was as if we were trapped in a dangerous dance, circling each other, waiting to see who would make the next move. On the 5th day, there was a formal dinner with the entire familia. The table was long enough to easily accommodate 20 people, all dressed in Italian elegance that made my borrowed dress seem inadequate, and Renzo sat at the head like the don he was, commanding the room just with his presence. I was seated more toward the middle of the table, between two older women who observed me with barely disguised curiosity, but not open hostility, and I tried to focus on the delicious food in front of me instead of on the man at the end of the table, whose eyes I could feel on my skin. "Are you Cousin Renzo's girlfriend?" The childish voice made me turn, and I found a small boy watching me with huge, curious eyes. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with messy dark hair and a smile that showed a missing tooth in front. I laughed, unable to contain my reaction to his innocence. "No, Piccolo, I'm a visitor. You're Bella," he declared with the brutal honesty of children. "He only looks at you." Automatically, my eyes moved to Renzo, and with a shock that ran down my spine, I realized the boy was right. Renzo was watching me at that exact moment, with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. And even from afar, even with a table full of people between us, I felt the impact of that gaze as if it were physical. "He looks at everyone," I said, forcing my attention back to the boy and trying to ignore the heat rising in my face. "Not like this." Alessandro leaned closer, whispering as if he were sharing an important secret. "When he likes someone, he makes a serious face." "More serious. How do you know?" I asked, genuinely curious now. "Nonna told me, before she died, said the Balochis love hard." He paused dramatically, clearly repeating words he'd heard from adults. "And dangerous." Something clenched in my chest, something I didn't want to examine too closely. "Do they?" "See, but they also protect. Always." Then, with the scattered attention typical of children, he ran off to show something to another cousin, leaving me alone with those words echoing in my head. "The Balochis love hard and dangerous." I looked at Renzo again, unable to resist, and this time he didn't look away. We stared at each other across the length of the table, through the conversations and laughter of the familia around us, and it was as if we were alone in the room. There was something in that look that made my breath catch, something that promised danger and passion in equal measures. Then he turned his attention to Agostino beside him, breaking the contact, and I felt the loss of it like a physical presence. The rest of the dinner passed in a fog. I ate without really tasting the food, participated in conversations without really registering the words, and the whole time I was hyper-aware of the man at the head of the table, of the way he laughed with the family, of the way he commanded even in a social setting. When dinner finally ended, I escaped to the gardens, needing fresh air and space to think. Alessandro's words kept echoing in my head, mixing with everything else I'd observed over the past few days, and I wondered if I was losing focus on my mission. I came here for revenge. I came here for answers. I came here to confront the man who destroyed my family. But the more time I spent here, the more the lines began to blur, and I no longer knew if Renzo Balacchi was my enemy, or something much more complicated. The next day, after lunch, I decided I needed concrete answers. I'd spent the entire week observing, waiting, being patient, but patience was never my strong suit, and the documents Renzo had shown me about my father kept tormenting me. I found his office without much difficulty, and entered without knocking, a deliberate statement that I wasn't going to blindly follow his rules. Renzo was sitting behind a huge mahogany desk, studying papers with that intense concentration that seemed natural to him. He didn't even look up when I entered. "I need to see documents. About my father." "No," he said, still not looking at me. "Why?" "Because I don't trust you." I approached the desk, hands braced on the polished surface. "Still not? After a week?" Now he looked up, and the impact of that dark gaze hit me with full force. "A week is nothing. Trust takes time." "How much time?" Renzo stood up with that fluid grace, rounding the desk until he was too close to me. "Depends. On what?" My voice came out more hoarse than I intended. "On how many times you try to seduce me," he said, and there was something dangerous in his tone, something that made my stomach clench. Indignation exploded in my chest. "I am not." Tight dresses, different perfume, smiles. He paused, studying me with that attention that seemed to see through me. "You think I don't notice? I'm not trying to seduce you." "No?" Renzo took another step, completely invading my personal space, and placed his hand on the wall beside my head, trapping me without actually touching me. "Then why does your heart race when I get close?" My breathing failed, betraying me completely. "Because you irritate me." "Liar." The word came out almost like a caress. I didn't lie. Then why aren't you moving away? He leaned closer, so close I could feel the heat of him, the woody scent that was starting to become too familiar. And he was right. I realized with a shock that ran down my spine that I wasn't moving away, that my body was leaning toward him instead of retreating, that every cell of my being was hyper-aware of his proximity. Because I'm not afraid of you, I said, and it was truth and lie at the same time. You should be, he whispered, so close now that I could feel his breath against my skin. Because I'm starting to like you, and that is dangerous. For both of us. The world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. Renzo was so close I could see the golden flecks in his dark eyes, could count every eyelash, could see the way his jaw clenched as if he were fighting some internal battle. He leaned in imperceptibly, and I realized he was going to kiss me, and more shocking still, I realized I wanted him to. Then a loud knock on the door separated us as if we'd been burned. Renzo, we have a problem. Agostino entered the office, and from the way he stopped abruptly when he saw us, it was clear he realized he'd interrupted something. Renzo moved away from me with that controlled calm I was beginning to recognize as his way of processing intense emotions. Che cosa? His voice was perfectly controlled, without any trace of the intimacy from seconds ago. Agostino looked at me, hesitant. Rivals, movement at the docks, and maybe we should talk alone. She stays. Renzo turned to me, and there was something different in his look now. You wanted truth? You'll get it. Agostino hesitated for another moment, then sighed. Okay, Familia D'Angelo is planning an attack. Tomorrow. Shipment from Naples. Shipment of what? I asked, genuinely curious. Agostino and Renzo exchanged a look, and I saw something that seemed almost like amusement pass between them. Olive oil, Renzo said, and the ironic tone was impossible to miss. Of course, olive oil. I didn't believe it for a second, but I didn't press either. Not yet. And you're coming with us. It took a second for his words to process. What? You want to know who killed your father? Come see how business works. Real business. This is crazy, I said, but even as the words came out, I felt adrenaline starting to rush through my veins. This is life. Renzo studied me with that disturbing intensity. Or you stay, like a child, protected. He knew exactly which button to push. My pride bristled immediately. I'm going. A smile formed on his lips. Small but genuine. Ben, wear black, okay? And cara mia? He paused, and there was something dangerous and exciting in his look. Tomorrow you'll find out if you really know me. I left the office with my heart beating erratically, and my hands trembling slightly. What had I just agreed to do? Go with Renzo Balocchi to some kind of mafia operation, presumably involving violence and danger, just days after confronting him about my father's murder? But even as logic told me I was being an idiot, another part of me, the part my father had trained to fight and survive, was excited by the prospect. Because maybe finally, I'd get to see Renzo Balocchi as he really was. Not the elegant man who commanded family dinners, but the brutal don who controlled a criminal empire. And maybe finally, I'd discover the truth about what happened to Marco Vicenzi, even if that truth destroyed me in the process. Chapter 4. Ambush and Lethal Revelation.
You're not my enemy!
The trip to Naples was made in tense silence, and I spent the whole time trying to control the nerves that threatened to consume me. The dark clothes Renzo had sent to my room fit my body perfectly. Black tactical pants and a long-sleeved shirt that allowed free movement. And for the first time since arriving at Villa Balocchi, I felt like myself, like the woman my father had trained to survive in a dangerous world. The car was luxurious but discreet, dark windows that didn't allow anyone to see inside, and Renzo was sitting next to me in the back seat, checking a gun with movements so natural it was clear this was routine for him. There were 3 other cars following us, full of men from the Famiglia, and the caravan moved through the Italian night like a deadly serpent hunting its prey. You stay in the car, Renzo said for the 3rd time, and his tone was one of absolute command, with no room for discussion. I'm not going to stay in the... Gunshots cut through my words like razors through silk. Everything happened too fast to fully process. The front windshield of the car exploded into thousands of fragments. The driver screamed something in Italian I didn't understand, and the car skidded violently to the side, as more shots echoed in the night, coming from all directions at once. Ambush! Agostino shouted from the car in front through the radio, and his voice was loaded with adrenaline and anger. Get out of the cars. Now. Renzo pushed me to the floor with one hand, while opening the door with the other, protecting my body with his, in a way that should have irritated me, but instead made something strange happen in my chest. Then he got out of the car in one fluid movement, gun already in hand, already firing at shadowy figures I could barely distinguish in the darkness of the docks. I dragged myself out of the car on his side, staying low behind the protection of the metal, and what I saw made my blood freeze. There were at least 20 men surrounding us, maybe more, all armed, all shooting with a precision that suggested professional training, and Renzo's men were clearly outnumbered. But what shocked me most was realizing that those men weren't wearing the colors of the D'Angelo Familia. They weren't the rivals Agostino had mentioned. They were others, and from the way they attacked with perfect knowledge of our route and our timing, it was clear that someone from the inside had passed on the information. Internal betrayal. I saw Renzo move with a deadly grace that was simultaneously terrifying and mesmerizing, each of his shots finding its target with surgical precision, each movement calculated for maximum efficiency. This wasn't the elegant man who presided over family dinners. This was the brutal Don who built an empire through blood and determination, and there was something primitive about the way my body reacted to seeing him like this. Then I saw 3 men approaching him from behind, while he was distracted with other attackers in front, and something inside me simply reacted before my brain could process the decision. The instinct my father spent years cultivating took over completely. I moved without thinking, years of training transforming my body into a fluid weapon. The first man didn't even see what hit him when I grabbed his gun with a Krav Maga move that disarms and unbalances at the same time, using his weight against him to throw him to the ground with enough force to leave him stunned. The second man tried to grab me, but I was already spinning, my elbow connecting with his face at an angle that guaranteed he wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. And then the gun I'd taken from the first man was in my hands, the familiar and comforting weight of a Glock 19 that was almost identical to the one my father had taught me to use. The third man raised his gun toward Renzo, and I didn't hesitate, didn't think, just pulled the trigger and saw his body fall, before the sound of the shot even finished echoing. The silence that followed was both absolute and deafening. The fight had ended as quickly as it began, the attackers who were still alive fleeing into the night, when they realized they'd lost the advantage of the element of surprise, and now only the men of the Famiglia remained standing among the bodies scattered across the docks, and all of them were looking at me with a mixture of shock and respect I'd never seen directed at me before. But I only had eyes for Renzo. He stood a few meters away, completely motionless, and there was blood on his face. I don't know if his own or from some attacker, and his clothes were torn in some places, revealing the skin underneath. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, something between admiration and disbelief, and something deeper that made my stomach clench. "Where did you learn that?" His voice was hoarse, loaded with emotion he usually hid so well. There was still adrenaline rushing through my veins, making my hands tremble slightly, making my heart beat so hard I could hear it in my ears. My father put me in training at 8, Krav Maga, target shooting, combat. I paused, the memory of Marco Vicenzi teaching me to punch correctly so vivid it was almost painful. He said his daughter would need to defend herself. Something changed in Renzo's face, understanding mixed with respect. He knew that you'd enter this world. Apparently, the word came out bitter, because my father never explained to me why I needed to learn to kill, never told me that his life as a Mafia accountant would eventually catch up with me, and now he was dead, and I'd never have the answers I needed. Renzo approached, and the way he moved was different now, more careful, as if he were seeing a version of me he didn't know existed. "You saved me. You would have done the same," I said, and it was true. I knew it deep in my bones. Maybe. He stopped in front of me, so close I could see the drops of blood on his neck, so close I could see the way his chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. "But no one has ever—" He stopped, and for the first time since I'd met him, Renzo Balocchi seemed vulnerable. "Ever what?" I asked softly. "Protected me, since I became Don." His words carried a weight I didn't expect, a loneliness I recognized because I'd felt the same since losing my father. There was something fundamentally human in his admission, something that broke another layer of the defenses I'd built against him. "Renzo," I said, and his name came out different now, more intimate, more real. See? The realization hit me like lightning, so strong and so clear I wondered how I hadn't seen it before. "You didn't kill my father." The silence that followed was loaded with tension, and Renzo studied me with that disturbing intensity of his. "How do you know?" "Because a man who kills for betrayal wouldn't hesitate to kill me for suspecting." The words came out in a rush now, fast and certain. "And you protect, even those who challenge you." I saw the exact moment he processed what I was saying, saw the way his jaw clenched, how his eyes narrowed slightly. "So why does someone want you to think it was me?" The question hung between us, heavy with implications I was only beginning to understand. Someone had manipulated me, someone had planted evidence, someone had guided me to Renzo with the clear intention of pitting us against each other. Someone manipulated me. Anger began to burn in my chest. Not the old anger directed at Renzo, but a new fury directed at whoever had orchestrated all of this. Planted evidence. Suspicions? Who? His voice was dangerously calm, the kind of calm that precedes violence. I closed my eyes, forcing my mind back to those first days after my father's death, forcing myself to remember details I'd ignored at the time because I was lost in grief and anger. Lazaro. He showed up after my father's death, offered help, always mentioned you, always with anger in his voice when he said your name. Lazaro. The way Renzo said the name was icy, loaded with a controlled fury that was more frightening than any explosion could be. Do you trust him? I did. He raised me after my father died. Renzo ran his hand through his hair, a rare display of frustration. But if he killed your father and manipulated you, what was the plan? Why do this? The answer came to me slowly, piece by piece, fitting into a horrible puzzle. For us to fall in love, I said, and the words came out almost like a whisper. And then I'd betray you, or kill you. Emotional destruction. The silence that followed was absolute. Renzo looked at me with an intensity that made my skin burn, and there was something in his eyes I couldn't name, something that made my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with the fight that had just happened. And did it work? He finally asked, his voice low and dangerous. Which part? Falling in love with me. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face. Fall in love with Renzo Bellocchi? With the man I came here to confront? With the Mafia Don who commanded an empire of violence and secrets? It was ridiculous. It was impossible. It was still deciding, I said, and it was lie and truth at the same time. Renzo laughed, and it was the first time I'd heard him really laugh, not the controlled sound he used at family dinners, but a genuine laugh that completely transformed his face. Liar, and maybe he was right. Maybe I'd already decided days ago. Maybe from the moment I walked into his room dressed in white silk and saw something in his eyes that defied everything I thought I knew about him. But admitting that, to him or to myself, seemed too dangerous, seemed like the kind of vulnerability that could destroy me completely. So I stayed silent, and Renzo didn't press, just looked at me with that disturbing understanding that suggested he knew exactly what I was feeling, even though I refused to say it out loud. Around us, the men of the Familia began to move, tending to the wounded, documenting the dead, cleaning the scene with the efficiency of those who'd done this many times before, and the reality of what had just happened began to seep through the adrenaline still running through my veins. I had killed a man, had shot him without hesitation, and he was dead because of me. My hands began to tremble for real now, and the gun I was still holding suddenly seemed too heavy. Renzo gently took it from my fingers, putting it away carefully, and then his hands were on my shoulders, firm and comforting. You did what you needed to do, he said, as if he could read my thoughts. You saved me, saved others. Don't regret it. But how could I not regret it? How did I live with the knowledge that I'd taken a life? As if Renzo knew exactly what was going through my head, he pulled me closer, and for the first time, I allowed myself to accept the comfort he offered, resting my forehead against his chest and letting the reality of what had happened hit me completely. Not regretting when regret dominates your thoughts and your heart is one of the hardest things for anyone, including me. Chapter 5. Confession of Fear and First Kiss.
Don't be afraid of me.
The trip back to Villa Bellocchi was completely different from the way there. The silence in the car was no longer loaded with nervous tension, but with something deeper, something I had no name for and didn't know if I wanted to name. Renzo was sitting next to me, his body relaxed in a way that completely contrasted with the violence we'd just experienced. And from time to time, I caught him watching me from the corner of his eye with an expression that made my stomach clench. When we finally arrived at the villa, it was past 3 a.m, and most of the men who'd accompanied us dispersed to tend to their own wounds, or to rest. Agostino said goodbye with a tired wave, but not before giving me a look that seemed to carry genuine respect, something that hadn't been there before tonight. Come, Renzo said, his voice breaking the silence for the first time in hours. I need you to take care of something. I followed him through the silent corridors of the villa until we reached his quarters, the same room where everything had started less than a week ago, when I'd entered dressed in white silk with the intention of confronting a killer and found something much more complicated. The room was exactly as I remembered, but now, being here with him felt different, loaded with an intimacy that didn't exist before. And when Renzo began to remove his torn, blood-stained shirt, revealing the muscular torso I'd only seen in shadows that first night, I felt heat rise in my face in a way that was both embarrassing and disturbing. You have soft hands, he said, as I guided him to sit on the edge of the bed, grabbing the first aid kit he'd pointed to in the bathroom. For a killer. The word hit me like a punch to the stomach, bringing back the memory of the man I'd killed, the weight of the gun in my hand, the sound of his body falling to the ground. I'm not a killer. Today you were. Renzo watched me as I began to clean the deep cut on his shoulder, the wound probably caused by a bullet that grazed him. How does it feel? I stopped for a moment, really thinking about the question, trying to put into words the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed me since the moment I pulled the trigger. Powerful, I finally said with brutal honesty, and terrible at the same time. Welcome to my world. There was something like understanding in his voice, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling because he'd gone through the same experience years ago. Is it always like this? I continued cleaning the wound carefully, trying not to hurt him more than necessary, but my hands trembled slightly with his proximity, with the heat of his skin under my fingers. Violence? See. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more vulnerable, but never with someone who matters watching. I stopped cleaning the wound completely, my eyes meeting his. I matter? The question hung between us for a long moment, and I saw something pass across his face, something that looked like fear mixed with acceptance, as if he were admitting something he'd been trying to deny to himself. That scares me, he finally said, and the raw honesty in his voice made my heart tighten in my chest. What? I whispered, barely able to find my voice. I'm not afraid of dying. Never have been. I live expecting it, actually. I've always known that would be my end eventually. Renzo raised his hand, his fingers lightly touching my face in a caress so gentle it was almost painful in its tenderness. But today, when you shot the man behind me, I was afraid. Of dying. It didn't make sense. He'd just said he wasn't afraid of death. Of liking you. His eyes pierced mine. Dark and intense and completely honest. Of liking you too much. My heart began to beat so hard I was sure he could hear it in the silence of the room. His words echoed in my head, mixing with everything else that had happened between us since that first night, and suddenly everything made sense in a terrifying way. You don't like me, I said, but the words came out weak, without conviction. His hand moved from my face to the nape of my neck, his fingers threading through my hair in a way that was both possessive and gentle. I'm trying not to. And how's that working out? The question came out almost like a challenge, and I saw the corner of his mouth curve into something that was almost a smile. Terribly, he pulled me a little closer, and suddenly the distance between us seemed minuscule and still too large at the same time. Especially when you look at me like that. Like what? I whispered, completely lost in his gaze. Like I'm a man, not a monster. His words carried a weight I didn't expect. A vulnerability that showed how much he really saw himself as the beast everyone said he was. And something inside me broke when I realized that Renzo Bellocchi, the brutal Don who commanded an empire of violence, really believed he was a monster incapable of being seen as anything more. You're a man, I said, the conviction clear in my voice. Complicated, yes. Dangerous for sure, but a man. Renzo leaned closer, his breath mixing with mine, and the entire world seemed to shrink to just the two of us in that room, on that bed, with the silent Sicilian dawn around us. Celeste, he said, and the name came out like a prayer and a curse at the same time. I could barely make the sound come out, trapped in his gaze, in his proximity, in the way his heart beat as hard as mine under the palm of my hand still pressed against his chest. If I kiss you now, everything changes. It wasn't a question, it was a warning, but even so I heard myself respond with an honesty that should have scared me. Maybe it already has. The kiss, when it finally happened, was different from anything I expected. It started soft, almost hesitant, as if Renzo were giving me the chance to pull back, to change my mind. But when he realized I wasn't going to move away, when he felt my hands move up to his hair and pull him closer, the kiss changed completely. Suddenly, there was urgency there. There was need. There were months of tension and denial exploding in a moment of pure intensity that made my entire world tilt on its axis. His hands were in my hair, on my waist, pulling me closer until I was practically in his lap, and I could feel the heat of his body through our clothes, could feel his heart beating as erratically as mine. When we finally pulled apart, both breathless, Renzo rested his forehead against mine, eyes closed, his breathing coming in short bursts that matched mine perfectly. Shit, he said, and the word came out hoarse and messy in a way that was so different from his usual control that I couldn't help but laugh. Eloquent, I said, still trying to catch my breath. His eyes opened, and there was something there that was both dangerous and vulnerable. You know what this means? That we're idiots? The answer came out before I could think better of it, and I saw the smile form on his lips, completely transforming the face that moments before had been all serious intensity. That now I'm going to have to kill anyone who looks at you, he said, and the tone was half serious, half playful in a way that made my stomach clench. A shiver ran down my spine, but it wasn't from fear. It was from something much more disturbing. possessive, completely. Renzo leaned in and kissed my neck, right where my pulse beat out of control, and the sensation of his lips against my skin made my eyes close involuntarily. "And you? What?" I could barely form the word, distracted by the way he kept kissing that spot on my neck that apparently had a direct line to the rest of my body. Jealous, if other women look at me. I opened my eyes and pushed him back slightly so I could see his face, and there was amusement there mixed with genuine curiosity. I thought about the question for a moment, trying to be honest with myself about what I really felt. Experimentally, yes, he laughed, and the sound was rich and genuine in a way I rarely heard from him. "Ben, so we understand each other." "About?" I tilted my head, genuinely curious now about where he was going with this. "That this is mine now." He touched my wrist with his fingers, right where my heart beat visible under the skin, and I don't share. I should have been indignant at the possessive declaration, should have reminded him that I wasn't his property or anyone's, should have resisted the way he was claiming me without asking permission. But instead, I found myself saying something completely different. "Possessive and arrogant. You'll get used to it," he said, and then kissed me again, slower this time, deeper, and I allowed myself to melt into his touch, into his hands, into the way he held me like I was the most precious thing in the world. When the kiss finally ended, we sat there for a long moment, just looking at each other, processing what had just happened between us and what it meant for everything else. I had come to Villa Balaki with the intention of confronting my father's killer, and instead, I just kissed the man I'd accused of that crime, the man I now knew was innocent, the man who had somehow become something much more important than I ever imagined possible. "Renzo," I said softly, touching his face with my hand. "Si, cara mia?" The casual way he used the term of endearment made something strange happen in my chest. What do we do now? It was a broad question, encompassing everything from Lazzaro and the betrayal to the two of us, and whatever this was becoming. "Now," he said, pulling me closer again, "we find out who really killed your father. Together." He paused, his eyes piercing mine. "Because you're my partner now, Celeste. In everything." His words should have scared me, should have made me pull back, but instead, I felt safe in a way I hadn't felt since my father died, as if I'd finally found someone who saw me as an equal, who respected me enough to fight by my side instead of protecting me from afar. "Partners then," I said, and sealed the deal with another kiss that quickly deepened until we were both breathless again, until his hands were under my shirt, warm against the skin of my abdomen, until I knew that if we didn't stop now, we wouldn't stop at all. "You should go," Renzo said, but his voice was hoarse, and the way he held me suggested he really didn't want me to go anywhere. "Probably," I agreed, but I didn't move, still lost in the heat of him, the smell of him, the way everything about him seemed to have been made to fit perfectly with me. "Celeste," he said my name like a warning and a plea at the same time. "I know." I finally forced myself to get off his lap, immediately feeling the loss of contact as something physical. "Good night, Renzo." "Good night, cara mia." He watched me leave the room with those dark eyes that seemed capable of seeing through every defense I had, and when I finally closed the door behind me and leaned against it in the empty corridor, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. I had kissed Renzo Balocchi, had admitted, both to him and to myself, that what I felt for him was much more than simple physical attraction or curiosity. And now, walking through the silent corridors of the villa toward my own room, I knew there was no going back. Everything had changed between us, and the only question now was what we would do about it. Chapter 6. Lazzaro revealed and crisis of trust.
He lied to us.
What? Are you sure?
We need to verify this immediately.
A week had passed since the night at the docks, since the first kiss, since everything changed between Renzo and me in a way that couldn't be undone. We spent those days in a kind of strange limbo, closer than ever, but still investigating, still searching for evidence to prove what we both knew deep in our souls, that Lazzaro Toretti was responsible for my father's death. Renzo included me in all the meetings now, treating me like an extension of himself, as if I'd always been part of the familia, and the other men began to respect me not just because I'd saved their Don, but because he made it clear I was important to him in a way no one had been before. We were in his office when Agostino entered with an expression on his face that immediately put me on alert. He was carrying a folder full of documents, and the way he held it suggested the contents were explosive. "Renzo, you need to see this," he said, placing the folder on the desk between us. Renzo opened it without hesitation, and I leaned in to see better, my heart beginning to race when I recognized the names on the documents. Bank transfers, statements, signatures that looked familiar, but were slightly wrong in a way that only someone who knew my father's handwriting as well as I did would notice. "Lazzaro," Agostino said, pointing to a series of transactions. "Bank transfers. Celeste's father's account." He paused heavily. "He forged documents. Marco Vicenzi never stole money." Fury exploded in my chest like a volcano, hot and devastating and completely overwhelming. "He forged them!" My voice came out louder than I intended, loaded with all the anger I'd accumulated over the years. Renzo's expression changed instantly, the mask of the brutal dawn falling into place, and when he spoke, his voice was icy in a way I rarely heard. Why? More, Agostino continued, turning more pages in the folder. Marco discovered that Lazzaro was embezzling funds. For years, Marco was going to expose him, so he didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication hung in the air between us like toxic smoke. Lazzaro killed my father. The words left my mouth like a death sentence. And manipulated me to... I looked at Renzo, seeing the understanding in his eyes. To destroy you. Not just destroy me, Renzo said, and there was something in his voice that was worse than anger. It was pain. Break me. Emotionally. He paused, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw real vulnerability on his face. He raised me. He knows that. He stopped abruptly, as if the words had gotten stuck in his throat. Knows what? I asked softly, touching his hand on the desk. His eyes met mine, and there was something there that made my heart squeeze in my chest. That I've never loved anyone, not even family, except... He looked at me in a way that made the entire world disappear. Now, the silence that followed was absolute. His words hung in the air like confession and condemnation at the same time, and I could see on Agostino's face that he was as shocked as I was by the involuntary admission Renzo had just made. I'll leave you two. Agostino started to get up, clearly uncomfortable. No, stay, I said quickly, because I needed answers now, couldn't wait. I turned to Renzo, my heart beating so hard I could hear it. You love me? The pause that followed was too long, too heavy. Does it matter? Of course it matters. Disbelief colored my voice. Why? Renzo gestured between the two of us with a hand that trembled slightly. You were put in my path, manipulated. This could just be programming. The pain his words caused was physical, as if he'd punched me in the stomach. You think it is? I don't know what to think anymore, he said, and there was so much anguish in his voice that I knew he was being completely honest. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Then maybe we should stop, until we figure it out. Maybe, he agreed. But the way he said the word made it clear we both hated that idea with every fiber of our beings. Or, Agostino said, breaking the tense silence, you confront Lazzaro, together, and find out the truth. Renzo and I looked at each other, and I saw in his eyes the same conflict I felt inside me. Fear mixed with determination. Doubt mixed with certainty. Risky, Renzo finally said. For who? I challenged. For you. If he realizes we know, he kills you. First. The protective way he said it made my heart squeeze. Then we do it before he realizes, I said, feeling determination harden inside me like steel. Something changed in Renzo's face. Something that looked suspiciously like pride. You don't back down. Never. I held his gaze, letting him see the truth in my words. So? Partners? Partners, he agreed, but then added, but if this goes to shit, you protect me? It was half question, half provocation. I die first, he said, and there wasn't a trace of hesitation in his voice. The silence that followed was loaded with the weight of that declaration. It wasn't just about protection. It was about sacrifice. It was about being willing to give his own life for mine, and the meaning of that was impossible to ignore. That's pretty intense for a business partnership, I said, trying to lighten the tension with humor, but my voice came out too hoarse to work. Renzo's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. Ben, because this was never just business. And there it was, the admission we'd both avoided making out loud. Whatever this was between us, it had long ago surpassed the boundaries of partnership or strategic alliance. It was personal in a way that was terrifying and inevitable at the same time. Agostino cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the intimate moment he was witnessing. So, what's the plan? I forced my attention back to the problem at hand, to Lazzaro and his betrayal, to my father's death that finally had a name and face responsible. We confront him, with the evidence, make him confess. And then? Agostino asked. Then, Renzo said, and his voice was icy in a way that reminded me exactly who he was. Famiglia Justice. His words were a death sentence, and we all knew it. Lazzaro Toretti had manipulated, lied, killed, and conspired, and now he was going to pay the price for all of it. I just hoped that when it was all over, when the truth finally came to light, Renzo and I could still look each other in the eyes and see something beyond the manipulation that brought us together. Because despite all his doubts, despite all my own uncertainties, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. What I felt for Renzo Bellocchi wasn't programming. It was choice. My choice. And I hoped that eventually he'd believe that too. Chapter 7. Confrontation with Lazzaro.
It's over, Lazzaro.
The plan was simple in theory, but executing it would be a completely different story. Renzo organized a casual dinner at the villa, just the three of us and Lazzaro, something that would seem like an informal business meeting, but in reality would be a carefully constructed trap to extract the confession we needed. I spent the entire day mentally preparing to face the man who killed my father, the man who spent years manipulating me with false kindness and poisoned advice, the man who orchestrated my entire life for the last 5 years with the sole objective of emotionally destroying Renzo Balocchi. Anger burned constantly in my chest like embers that never went out, but I kept it controlled, cold, because I needed to be in complete control when the time came. Renzo found me in my room an hour before dinner. He entered without knocking, as had become his habit in recent weeks, and the familiarity of that gesture should have bothered me, but instead it comforted me in a strange way. "Are you ready?" he asked, and there was concern in his eyes that warmed me inside. "I was born ready," I said, adjusting the dark dress I'd chosen specifically for tonight, something elegant, but that allowed free movement in case things got out of control. Renzo approached, his hands finding my waist in a gesture that had become natural between us. "If at any point you want to stop, just say so. I'll handle this alone." I placed my hands over his, holding him there. "No, this is as much mine as it is yours. My father, my revenge." Something passed across his face, something that looked like respect mixed with concern. "Just promise you'll be careful." "I promise," I said, and sealed the promise with a quick kiss that quickly threatened to deepen until we both remembered we had a task ahead. When we went down to the dining room, Agostino was already there, nervous but determined. The table was set for 4, the food already served, everything seeming perfectly normal, except for the tension that permeated the air like electricity before a storm. Lazzaro arrived punctually at 8, dressed impeccably as always, the gentle smile on his face that I now recognized as a mask carefully constructed over decades. He greeted Renzo with the familiarity of someone who'd raised him, greeted me with that excessive interest that always made me uncomfortable, and sat at the table as if he didn't have a care in the world. "Renzo, Celeste, how domestic you two have become," he said, and there was something in his tone that sounded slightly disdainful, as if our closeness amused him somehow. "Sit, vecchio amico," Renzo said, gesturing to the chair across from him, and I noticed the way he emphasized "old friend" with just a hint of sarcasm. Lazzaro sat, but there was something different about him now, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there when he entered. He sensed that something had changed, that the atmosphere was wrong somehow. "Everything all right?" "Perfect," I said, pouring wine into his glass with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "We were talking about discoveries, recent ones." His eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "What kind of discoveries?" Renzo placed the documents on the table between them, the movement deliberate and controlled. "Marco Vicenzi, you said he stole 2 million. There was a minuscule pause before Lazzaro responded, so brief that someone who wasn't looking for it might miss it. "And he did. Lie," I said, the word coming out with all the anger I'd held back for so long. "You stole. And when my father found out, you killed him." The silence that followed was so dense, it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Lazzaro went completely still, and then, slowly, the mask of the kind old man began to fall, revealing something much darker underneath. When he smiled, it was the smile of a predator who'd finally decided to stop pretending. "You shouldn't have found that out," he said, and his voice was completely different now, cold and calculating in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "Why?" Renzo leaned forward, his posture changing from relaxed to dangerous in a second. "Because Celeste was the perfect weapon against me?" "Exactly." Lazzaro picked up his wine glass, taking a sip as if we were having a casual conversation about the weather. "Daughter of the man you killed, hunting you, falling in love, and then," the smile turned cruel, "betraying you, or dying trying to kill you. Maximum pain for the man who never suffered." Nausea rose in my throat hearing everything laid out so coldly. "You planned everything. For years." "Years," he confirmed, and there was pride in his voice, as if he were talking about an artistic masterpiece instead of a murderous conspiracy. "Every casual encounter, every hint about Renzo, every encouragement to investigate." He looked directly at me, and it worked perfectly, "until you really fell in love." The way he said the last words, with disdain mixed with frustration, made it clear that this wasn't in his plans, that Renzo and I developing genuine feelings for each other had been the only variable he couldn't control. "You raised me," Renzo said, and for the first time since I'd met him, I heard real pain in his voice, the pain of a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound could. "And now I destroy you." Lazzaro placed the glass back on the table with excessive care. "Because you never knew your place, never respected me as I deserved. I made you Dawn, and you treated me like a simple advisor." The bitterness was clear now. "Your death will be slow, watching her die first." Everything happened in slow motion and impossible speed at the same time. Lazzaro moved to grab the gun he had hidden at his waist, but years of training made me react before my brain could fully process the threat. I threw myself across the table, knocking over plates and glasses, my hand reaching his wrist before he could point the gun at either of us. The fight that followed was brutal and quick. Lazaro was older, but experienced, and he fought with the ferocity of a man who had nothing to lose. His elbows crashed against my ribs, trying to make me let go, but I maintained control of his armed hand while using my weight to unbalance him. Years of Krav Maga taught me that in a real fight, there were no pretty moves or perfect technique. There was only survival. I twisted his wrist at an angle where I heard something crack, and the gun fell to the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the hall. Renzo was there in a second, grabbing Lazaro by the collar and throwing him against the wall with enough force to knock the air from the older man's lungs. I picked up the gun from the floor, keeping it pointed at Lazaro while Renzo held him immobilized. "Should have trained the girl better," Lazaro spat, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue on impact. But I underestimated how much Marco Vicenzi loved his daughter. "He loved me enough to prepare me for men like you," I said, my voice coming out firmer than I felt. Renzo looked at me over his shoulder, and there was something in his gaze that was pure astonishment. "You're incredible. We're a good team," I replied, and I saw the moment he processed those words, their full meaning. "The best." He turned his attention back to Lazaro, and the mask of the brutal Don was firmly in place now. "And Celeste? See? What I feel for you isn't programming. It's choice. My choice." His words echoed through the hall, a public declaration in front of the man who'd tried to manipulate us, a complete rejection of everything Lazaro had planned. And despite the situation, despite the violence that had just happened, my heart filled with something warm and sweet. "Even after everything? The manipulation?" I asked, needing to hear him confirm it. "Especially after," Renzo said, never taking his eyes off Lazaro. "Because you chose to stay, to fight, with me." Tears burned in my eyes, but they were tears of relief, not sadness. Everything I'd needed to hear, everything I'd feared was a lie, he'd just confirmed as truth. "How touching," Lazaro spat with disdain. "You think this matters? That love changes anything? You're still a monster, Renzo, and she's still the daughter of the man I killed. This will poison you until there's nothing left." "No," I said, moving closer until I was beside Renzo, presenting a united front. "You have no power over us anymore. It's over." Renzo was about to respond when hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. Agostino appeared in the doorway of the hall, his face pale and worried in a way that immediately put me on maximum alert. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation." The way he said it, the urgency in his voice, made it clear that something very serious was happening, something that couldn't wait even for the end of this confrontation. Renzo and I exchanged a look, and in that moment, we communicated volumes without saying a word. Whatever was happening, we'd face it together, as partners, as equals, as something much deeper than either of us was ready to name out loud yet. Chapter 8: External Threat and Fierce Protection. The situation Agostino brought was worse than any of us could have imagined. We gathered in Renzo's office while two men from the Familia took Lazaro to the basement, where he would be held until we decided exactly what to do with him, and the tension in the air was so dense I could barely breathe properly. "Rival Famiglis found out about Lazaro," Agostino said, spreading photos and reports across the mahogany desk. "They think we're weakened, vulnerable." He paused heavily, his eyes meeting mine with something that looked like pity. "And they want Celeste." The silence that followed was absolute. I felt Renzo's body tense beside me, every muscle contracting as if he were preparing to attack something that wasn't physically present in the room. "Why?" His voice came out dangerously calm, the kind of calm I'd learned meant he was seconds away from exploding into violence. "Because now everyone knows," Agostino said, looking at Renzo with something that seemed like genuine concern, "that she's your weakness." Anger exploded in my chest like liquid fire. "I'm not a weakness." "No," Renzo said, turning to look at me with an intensity that made my heart stop. He stopped, searching for the right words. "Everything, which is worse, because now I have something to lose." His words carried a weight that went far beyond fear for my safety. They carried the recognition that I had become the most important thing in his life, the only thing that could truly destroy him if it were taken away. And despite the seriousness of the situation, something warm bloomed in my chest. "So, what do we do?" I asked, forcing my mind to focus on the immediate problem instead of getting lost in what his words meant. "You hide. I deal with the rivals." His tone left no room for discussion. It was pure command from a Don accustomed to being obeyed without question. Not a chance. I crossed my arms, planting my feet firmly on the floor in a way that made it clear I wasn't backing down on this. "We're partners." "Celeste." "Renzo," I interrupted before he could start arguing. "I'm not going to hide while you fight alone." I paused, letting a small smile form on my lips. Besides, you saw how I fight. I'm useful. I saw the conflict pass across his face. Pride fighting with fear, respect for my ability, fighting with the instinct to protect me at any cost. You're going to be the death of me, or your salvation, I replied softly, touching his face with my hand. Do you trust me? His eyes pierced mine. Dark and intense and completely honest. With my life. Then let's end this. Together. Agostino cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the intimate moment, but also impressed with the determination we both displayed. They're going to attack tomorrow, at dawn, on the road to Naples. Then we'll be ready, Renzo said, his voice returning to command tone. Gather all the men. I want our best team. And Agostino? He looked at his cousin with a serious expression. If something happens to me, you protect her, no matter the cost. Nothing's going to happen to you, I said with conviction. But Renzo just looked at me with that look that said he'd lived long enough in this world to know nothing was guaranteed. Dawn came too quickly, and I found myself preparing weapons alongside Renzo, in a silence that was both comfortable and loaded with tension. He'd given me a Glock identical to the one I'd used at the docks, and the familiar weight in my hand was comforting in a strange way. You stay at my back, Renzo said for the 5th time as we checked the magazine of the last gun. Always where I can see you, and you stay where I can cover you, I replied, refusing to be relegated to a passive position even now. The attack came exactly when Agostino had predicted, multiple families working together in a temporary alliance with the sole objective of taking down the Bellocchi famiglia while they thought we were weak. But what they didn't expect was that we were prepared, that we'd turned that road into a carefully constructed trap. The fight that followed was chaotic and brutal in ways that even the ambush at the docks hadn't been. There were at least 30 men attacking, maybe more, and the sound of gunfire echoed across the Sicilian landscape like artificial thunder. But Renzo and I moved together as if we'd trained side by side for years instead of weeks. I covered his back while he advanced. He protected my flanks when I needed to reload. And there was a synchronicity between us that was almost supernatural, as if we could read each other's thoughts just by the way we moved. It was like dancing with a perfect partner, each movement flowing naturally into the next, each action complementing the others in a way that made us both stronger together than apart. When the last attacker fell, when silence finally descended on the road stained with blood and destruction, I allowed myself to breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. My body ached in places I didn't even know could hurt. There was a deep cut on my arm that would probably need stitches, and my clothes were torn and stained with blood that wasn't all mine. But I was alive, and Renzo was alive, and that was all that mattered. Never again, Renzo said, approaching me with steps that revealed he was also injured. There was blood dripping from a cut on his forehead, and the way he favored his left side suggested broken or at least bruised ribs. You never risk yourself like that again. If you don't risk yourself, I don't risk myself, I replied, gently touching the cut on his forehead. That's not how this works. That's how I work. I held his face with both hands, forcing him to look directly at me. Renzo, I love you, completely, and love means fighting, together. The words came out before I could think better of it, but the moment I said them, I knew they were true in a way that couldn't be denied. I loved Renzo Bellocchi, with all his flaws and dangers and complications. I loved him in a way that went beyond logic or reason. He went completely still, looking at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Then, so softly I almost missed the words, he said, I love you too. My heart stopped completely before starting to beat erratically. That's why, he continued, and then did something completely unexpected. Renzo Bellocchi, Don of the most powerful familia in Sicily, knelt right there, in the middle of the blood-stained road, with the bodies of enemies scattered around us, with adrenaline still running through both our veins, and looked at me with a vulnerability I'd never seen in him before. Marry me. For a long moment, I thought I'd heard wrong. What? Marry me. Be my wife, my partner, He stopped, searching for the right word. Everything. Tears began streaming down my face before I could even think about controlling them. Years of pain and loneliness and anger finally giving way to something warm and sweet and completely overwhelming. Is this a request or an order? I asked, trying to bring some humor to the moment but failing when my voice came out too choked. A desperate request. There was so much love in his eyes it was almost painful to look directly at. Yes. The word came out as a whisper first, then louder. Always yes. Renzo stood up in one fluid movement and pulled me into a kiss that was both gentle and desperate, loaded with everything we'd been through together, with all the violence and passion and love that brought us to this moment. I didn't care that we were covered in blood and dirt, didn't care that there were bodies around us, didn't care about anything but the feeling of his lips against mine, his hands in my hair, the way he held me like I was the most precious thing in the world. When we finally pulled apart, both breathless, the sound of slow clapping made us both turn. Agostino stood a few meters away, a huge smile on his bloodied face. Finally, and despite everything, Despite the battle that had just happened, despite the injuries and exhaustion, we both laughed, the sound echoing across the Sicilian road like a promise of better days to come. Chapter 9. Famiglia and Sweet Moments.
This is my home.
The weeks following the marriage proposal passed in a fog of preparations and celebrations, and for the first time since arriving at Villa Balocchi, I allowed myself to really believe that maybe I'd found a place where I belonged. Lazzaro was being held somewhere safe, awaiting the Familia's judgment. The rival families had backed down after the brutal show of force on the road, and for the first time in years, I felt something like peace. The villa was full of Renzo's relatives I didn't even know existed, all arriving from different parts of Italy for the wedding preparations. There were aunts who hugged me like they'd known me my whole life, cousins who greeted me with cautious respect, mixed with curiosity, and a general energy of celebration that was both overwhelming and comforting. I was in the garden supervising the floral decorations when I heard small footsteps running in my direction. I turned just in time to see Alessandro running at full speed, his arms open and his smile showing the gap where his front tooth was starting to grow back. "Zia Celeste, you're going to be my real Zia," he shouted, practically throwing himself into my arms with the full force of a 6-year-old rocket. I caught him in my arms, laughing at his enthusiasm, and felt something warm expand in my chest, hearing how naturally he called me aunt. "See, Piccolo, and you're going to be my ring bearer?" His eyes widened so much they seemed to take up half his face. "Can I? With the ring and everything?" "Of course you can." Renzo's deep voice came from behind me, and I turned my head to see him approaching with that confident walk that had become so familiar. But what struck me most was the expression on his face as he watched Alessandro and me together. There was something there that made my heart squeeze in my chest, a tenderness he rarely showed, a vulnerability reserved only for moments like this. Alessandro squirmed in my arms until he could see Renzo better, his smile getting even bigger if that was possible. "Cugino Renzo, are you going to have bambini with Zia Celeste?" The sound Renzo made was something between a cough and a choke, and I saw the flush rise slightly on his neck, in a way that was absolutely adorable in a man who was usually so controlled. One day, maybe. I felt my own face heat up at Alessandro's direct question, his innocence making it impossible to be angry at the invasion of privacy. Alessandro, too early to think about that. But Alessandro just shrugged with the frightening wisdom children sometimes display. "Nonna always said, Familia Balocchi needs to continuare." He looked at me with those huge, serious eyes. "And you're strong like Louis. Bambini will be strong too." I couldn't help but laugh at his simple logic. "Thanks, I think." Alessandro leaned closer, whispering loud enough that Renzo could definitely hear, even while pretending to check something on his phone. "And Louis is happier, since you arrived. Smiles more." Instinctively, my eyes moved to Renzo, and with a shock of recognition, I realized Alessandro was completely right. Renzo was smiling as he watched us, not the controlled smile he used in business, but something genuine and warm that completely transformed his face. "He is? See, before he was always serious. Sad. Now." Alessandro gestured with his little hands in a way that was absolutely Italian, loose in his eyes. The Italian word echoed in my heart in a way words rarely do. Loose, light, Alessandro translated with the patience of someone used to switching between languages. "You brought light to Louis." Then he hugged me with the surprising strength of a child, his little arms squeezing my neck. "Grazie." Tears burned in my eyes before I could control them. Years of loneliness and pain finally giving way to the acceptance I didn't even know I needed so much. "Grazie a te, Piccolo." Alessandro eventually let go and ran off to show something to another cousin, leaving Renzo and me alone among the flowers that would be used at the wedding. He approached, his hands finding my waist in a gesture that had become natural between us, and pulled me back against his chest as we both watched Alessandro play with the other children. "He's right, you know," Renzo said softly, his voice vibrating against my back in a comforting way. "About what?" I asked, relaxing completely against him. "You brought light, to me, to everyone here." I felt him pause, as if searching for the right words. "Before you, I just existed, commanded, made decisions, survived. But I didn't live, not really." I turned in his arms so I could see his face, and the raw honesty I saw in his dark eyes made my heart race. "And now I have something to live for. Not just survive, but really live." He touched my face with that gentleness that contrasted so completely with the brutality he was capable of showing. "You gave me that." Night fell over Sicily with that specific beauty I'd learned to love, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink that eventually gave way to deep blue speckled with stars. Most of the relatives had retired to their rooms, or to the nearby town where many were staying. And finally, Renzo and I had a moment of peace on the terrace overlooking Etna. "You're good with him," Renzo said, breaking the comfortable silence as we watched the volcano smoke gently in the distance. "With Alessandro, he's special," I replied, thinking of the 6-year-old boy who had embraced my heart so easily. "His parents died when he was 3. Agostino takes care of him the best he can, but—" Renzo paused, the vulnerability clear in his voice. He needed a mother figure. I turned to look at him, realizing where the conversation was going. "And you think?" His eyes met mine, dark and intense even in the dim light of the terrace. "I think you'll be an amazing mother. Someday." He paused again. "If you want." My heart beat harder in my chest at the implication of those words, at the images they conjured of a future I hadn't even allowed myself to imagine until recently. "With you?" His expression changed instantly, something possessive and protective and intense taking over. "Only with me." He pulled me closer, his hands firm on my waist. "Always only with me." I couldn't help but laugh at the intensity of the declaration, possessive even about hypothetical children, especially about them, he said, completely serious. "You're mine, all of you, present, future, children, everything." A shiver ran down my spine at the possessive declaration, but instead of feeling suffocated, I felt protected in a way I hadn't experienced since my father died. "And you're mine? Completely. Until death." There was no hesitation in his voice, only absolute certainty. Then he kissed me, and it was different from the urgent kisses after fights, or the hesitant kisses from the beginning. This kiss was a promise. It was a commitment. It was the sealing of a future we were both consciously choosing to build together. His hands moved to my hair, holding me close as he deepened the kiss, and I allowed myself to melt completely into him, letting all the rest of the world disappear until there were only the two of us under the Sicilian sky. When we finally pulled apart, both breathless, we stayed there embraced for a long moment, just existing in the shared space. And for the first time since my father died, I felt I'd found a home. "Renzo," I said softly against his chest. The sound vibrated against my cheek. "About Bambini," I began, feeling his body tense slightly with attention. "Eventually, when we're ready, I want them." I felt more than heard his breathing stop for a moment before returning. Deeper now. "Eventually," he agreed, but there was something in his voice that suggested eventually wasn't as far away as I might think. "What's the rush?" I teased, looking up to see his face. His eyes met mine, and there was something there that was both dangerous and exciting. "All the rush. I want to see you pregnant, my child, our familia." The way he said it, with so much possessiveness and desire mixed together, made my stomach clench in a way that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with anticipation. "Renzo," I said, a warning and an invitation at the same time. "See, I love you infinitely." He pulled me into another kiss, deeper this time, more promising. "Ti amo anch'io, mia moglie, mia regina, e mia vita." The Italian words echoed in my heart, and as we kissed under the Sicilian stars, with Etna smoking in the distance, and the future stretching promisingly before us, I knew I'd finally found where I belonged. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't just about discovering the truth about my father's death. It was about building something new from what had been destroyed. It was about transforming pain into love, anger into passion, loneliness into family. It was about Renzo and me, and the future we'd choose to build together. Chapter 10: Wedding and Shared Empire.
Forever begins today.
The morning of my wedding dawned with the Sicilian sky painted in shades of gold and pink that seemed to have been chosen specifically by the gods to bless this day. I woke up in the guest room where I'd spent that first frightening night weeks ago, but now everything was different. I was different, and in a few hours I'd leave this room as Celeste Vicenzi for the last time. The dress waiting for me was a classic Italian masterpiece, delicate lace that had belonged to Renzo's grandmother, combined with modern silk that hugged my body in a way that was both elegant and sensual. The veil was ancient, passed down through generations of Balocchi women, and when Renzo's aunts placed it over my head, I felt the weight of the tradition and acceptance it represented. The church in Taormina was small but ancient, with frescoes dating back centuries and wooden pews polished by time in the hands of countless faithful. It was filled to overflowing with members of the familia, all dressed in their finest Italian attire, all here to witness the union that would transform a dead accountant's daughter into the Donna of the Balocchi familia. When the doors opened and I began walking down the aisle, the entire world seemed to shrink to just the man waiting for me at the altar. Renzo was dressed in a suit that probably cost more than a car, impeccable black, that contrasted perfectly with the white shirt, but it was the look on his face that made my heart stop completely before starting to beat erratically. He was looking at me like I was the only person in the universe. Like every step I took toward him was the most important thing that had ever happened in the history of humanity, and there was so much love in those dark eyes that I felt tears threaten to ruin the makeup that had taken hours to apply. Alessandro stood beside Renzo, dressed in a small suit that was a perfect replica of his, holding the pillow with the rings with a seriousness that was absolutely adorable in a 6-year-old. When I passed him, I saw the small smile he couldn't completely hide, and I sent him a wink that made the smile grow even bigger. The priest began the ceremony with the traditional words in Italian, his voice echoing through the ancient walls of the church, but I could barely concentrate on anything but Renzo, the way his hand held mine so firmly, the way his thumb traced unconscious circles on my skin. Renzo Bellocchi, do you take Celeste Vicenzi as your wife, to protect, honor, and love for all the days of your life? I do. Oggi e sempre. His voice was firm and clear, without any trace of hesitation, and the Italian words echoed in my heart like a sacred promise. Celeste Vicenzi, do you take Renzo Bellocchi as your husband, to protect, honor, and love for all the days of your life? I didn't wait for the priest to finish completely. I do, con tutto il cuore. A murmur of approval ran through the congregation, and I saw the smile form on Renzo's lips, small but genuine, and completely directed at me. The priest continued with the traditional blessings, but when it came time to exchange rings, Alessandro stepped forward with the pillow, his little face serious as if he were executing the most important task in the world. Renzo took my ring first, sliding it onto my finger with a care that contrasted with the strength I knew those hands were capable of exerting, and then it was my turn to do the same with him. I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. The kiss that followed was different from all the ones we'd shared before. It was long and deep, and loaded with years of tension and passion and love that finally had permission to exist openly. Renzo held me like I was the most precious thing in the world, one hand on my waist and the other on my face, and I allowed myself to melt completely into him while the church exploded in applause and shouts of celebration around us. When we finally pulled apart, both breathless and with idiotic smiles on our faces, Alessandro shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, "Now make bambini!" The entire church burst into laughter, and even Renzo couldn't hide the flush that rose slightly on his neck, but he just took my hand and began guiding us down the aisle toward the exit, toward where our future waited for us. The party at the villa was exactly the kind of Italian celebration I'd seen in movies but never experienced personally. There was enough food to feed a small army, wine flowing as if the fountains had been converted specifically for that purpose, and music that made even the oldest and most serious members of the familia get up to dance. The main table was positioned to have the best view of Mount Etna, and Renzo and I sat side by side with our hands intertwined on the table, watching our familia celebrate with a joy that seemed to have been contained for too long. Agostino eventually stood up, raising his wine glass in a toast that made the entire crowd quiet to listen. "Alla familia, old and new." He looked directly at me with a genuine smile. "May Donna Bellocchi bring as much strength as she brought light." "Alla familia," the crowd repeated in unison, glasses raising and clinking in harmonious chaos. And then, because apparently Alessandro had decided it was his personal duty to make sure everyone knew his opinions about our reproductive future, he shouted again, "E bambini futuros!" The crowd exploded in laughter and approval, and Renzo leaned in to whisper in my ear, "He's not going to let this go, is he?" "Apparently not," I said, laughing against his shoulder. The night continued with dancing and celebration, but eventually, Renzo pulled me away from the crowd, taking me to the more private terrace where everything had begun between us. The full moon illuminated Etna in the distance, and the view was so perfect, it seemed to have been painted especially for this moment. "And now?" I asked, leaning against the stone railing while Renzo stood behind me, his arms circling my waist. "Now?" He kissed my neck, right where he knew it made me lose my train of thought. "You share everything with me. Empire, decisions, power." He paused significantly. "Equal." I turned in his arms so I could see his face, needing to confirm I'd heard correctly. "Equal. Donna and Don, together." His eyes pierced mine with absolute intensity. "And Celeste, see?" His expression changed to something that was both dangerous and protective. "Anyone who touches you dies. Anyone who disrespects you disappears. Anyone who threatens you." He paused deliberately. "Prays I don't find them." A shiver ran down my spine, but it wasn't from fear. It was from something much more primitive and disturbing, possessive and protective. "And you're my equal in this," he said, a small smile forming on his lips. "Any woman who looks at me will deal with me." I finished with a smile that probably looked more dangerous than I intended. "And I definitely won't go easy." Renzo laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Perfect." Then his expression became more serious, more intense, and about Bambini. "Eventually," I said, but there was less conviction in the word than before. "How eventually?" He pulled me closer, his hands possessive on my waist. "What's the rush?" His eyes darkened with something that made my stomach clench. "All the rush. I want to see you pregnant, my child. Our familia." "Renzo," his name came out as warning and plea at the same time. "See? I love you. Infinitely. Ti amo anch'io." He kissed me, deep and promising. Mia Mogli, Mia Regina, Mia Vita. 2 years later, the meeting room in the Palazzo in Rome was full of men from the Familia, all dressed in expensive suits and discussing the latest business developments with the seriousness such matters deserved. But what would have been impossible to imagine a few years ago was the 6-month pregnant woman sitting at the head of the table beside the Don, actively participating in every decision and being heard with the same respect as him. Operation Palermo needs more men, I said, studying the reports spread in front of me. Agostino, now officially my second in command in certain operations, nodded in agreement. I agree. Donna Bellocchi is right. I felt Renzo's hand move to my rounded belly, his touch gentle and possessive at the same time. Always is. There was so much pride in his voice it made my heart swell. And this one will learn early. The meeting room door suddenly opened, and Alessandro, now 8 years old and much taller than he'd been at the wedding, entered with the confidence of someone who knew he had permission to interrupt. Boy or girl? He asked without preamble. Surprise, I replied, smiling at the boy who'd become like a son to me over the past years. But Renzo wants a boy. I want healthy, Renzo corrected, but then added, but a boy would be convenient. Continue the line. And if it's a girl? I teased, already knowing the answer. The smile Renzo gave me was pure love, mixed with determination. Then she'll be the most feared Dawn in Sicily. Alessandro practically jumped with excitement. Can I teach baby to shoot? The entire room burst into laughter, and I exchanged a look with Renzo that clearly said, this is your fault. When they're older, Piccolo, I said eventually, still laughing. The meeting continued for another hour, but eventually everyone dispersed, leaving only Renzo, me, and Alessandro in the large palazzo. We moved to the terrace overlooking the city, and the beauty of Rome at dusk never failed to impress me, but it was Renzo's hand intertwined with mine that really made everything seem perfect. Our familia, Renzo said softly, watching Alessandro play near the plants. Perfect. Finally, I agreed, leaning against him and feeling the baby kick lightly, as if agreeing with the assessment. We stayed in comfortable silence for a long moment, just existing in the shared space, until Renzo broke the quiet with a question that seemed to have weight beyond the simple words. Renzo, are you still afraid of liking me? He laughed softly, the sound vibrating against my back. Cara mia, now I'm afraid of losing you. Much worse. I turned in his arms, touching his face with my hand. You'll never lose me. Promise. Promise, he repeated, sealing it with a kiss that was as full of love as the first we'd shared. I love you. And there, on the terrace in Rome, with our familia around us and our future growing inside me, I knew I'd found something I'd never looked for, but desperately needed. A home, a partner, a love that would survive any storm. I'd come to Sicily looking for revenge and found redemption. I'd come looking for a killer and found a husband. I'd come looking for justice and found love. And now, with Renzo's hand on my belly and the future stretching promisingly before us, I knew that all the choices I'd made, all the risks I'd taken, all the fights I'd fought, had been completely worth it. This was my familia now, my empire, my love, my life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Final reflection. This is a story about how pain can transform into power, and revenge can give way to the most unlikely love. Celeste Vicenzi enters Villa Bellocchi with a broken heart and thirst for justice, convinced that Renzo is the monster who destroyed her family. But what she finds is a man as broken as she is, equally a prisoner of manipulations and lies. Their journey is visceral and intense, each confrontation loaded with an electric chemistry that defies logic, each touch burning with the promise of something forbidden and irresistible. There's violence, yes, blood and constant danger, but there are also moments of devastating vulnerability when two survivors finally lower their guards and allow the other to see their deepest wounds. The story's energy pulses between extremes, from icy fury to burning desire, from paralyzing fear to fierce courage, from absolute loneliness to the overwhelming intimacy of two souls who recognize each other through chaos. It's romance at its purest essence, where love doesn't mean peace, but lethal partnership, where protection comes through shared strength, and where the happy ending is one with blood, tears, and the conscious choice to build something beautiful from the ashes of what was destroyed. And if you want to see another romance video, click on the video appearing now on your screen.